Hello, everyone. I am Claudiu Murgan, the host of the Spiritually Inspired podcast. And today, my guest is Philip Goldberg. Philip is the author and co author of numerous books, a public speaker and workshop leader, a spiritual counselor, meditation teacher, and ordained interfaith minister. He co hosts the Spirit Matters podcast, leads American Veda India Tours, conducts online courses and workshops, and blogs regularly on Elephant Journal and Spirituality and Health. Two of Philip's most important books are The Life of Yogananda, the story of a yogi who became the first modern guru, and Spiritual Practice for Crazy Times, powerful tools to cultivate calm, clarity, and courage. Philip, thank you very much for joining me today.
Great to be with you, Claudio.
And we'll talk about your books, your programs, and I will start with, let's say, the beginning. As a student, you were restless in finding answers to the big questions that, academia, conventional religion, psychology, and politics had failed to provide. But then you found transcendental meditation. Can you share some of that experience with us and the important lessons that transpired for you personally?
Well, it's even more complicated, because the time frame was the late 1960s, not to make myself seem old. But so there's a lot of turmoil, and I was caught up in it, like a lot of my fellow young people. And I had grown up with anti-religious people. I had no religious training. It all seemed, I had a sort of Marxist opium of the people attitude toward it all. But in my search for what is life about and what's true and how do you live a fulfilled life and, all the other questions, I was immersed in, as you said, in psychology and politics, and nothing conventional answered my questions. And in that process, I just was reading all the time, and that led, in the spirit of the times, to reading about the philosophies and spiritual methodologies that came from the East, what people think of as Buddhism and Hinduism, but which appeared to me to be sensible and rational and non-sectarian. They didn't ask me to believe in anything that I couldn't find rational. And so I was drawn by some miracle of karma, I guess, to those teachings. And I went into it full force. And one of the things you discover when you start reading about these things is the importance of practice, of having a method. And around that same time, the Beatles met Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and went to India. And it was, the one book you didn't mention is my book, American Veda, and which talks about the whole history of all the teachings from the East coming to the West. And in that, I single out that moment when the Beatles sort of brought India and the West together as a turning point. And it was for me as well. And so I experimented with a lot of practices and ended up finding transcendental meditation, what we call TM, to be very powerful and suitable for me. And I got deeply into that for many years.
So do you think that over the years that influence of TM has been maintained and younger generations got the benefits of it?
Yeah, they're still very active. It's nothing like the explosion of interest in it back in the late 60s and early 70s when, it was huge media phenomenon. But all these years later, people still learn the practice because, it works. There's a lot of scientific evidence for it, and it's easy to learn and do. And it's a traditional form of meditation. It was formulated in a certain way for modern seekers and practitioners, but it's a very traditional practice that yogis have been doing for many, many centuries. So,
Yes.
and it remains, with everything else I've learned, it remains a centerpiece of my own daily practice.
Yes, and it's interesting because another yoga technique which touch on science is Kriya Yoga, and from here we go to Paramahansa Yogananda. You wrote a book about him. So out of all the Eastern gurus, why Yogananda?
Why did I write a biography of Yogananda?
Yes.
When I wrote American Veda, I profiled all the teachers, all the gurus who came to the West and had an impact. There's a lot more in the book, but that's part of it. And some of them had a much bigger impact than others, and so I devoted more time, space to them. Yogananda was one. And in the course of writing about him, and then later being a talking head in a movie about him, I came to more fully appreciate the impact he had, which was deep and profound. But I also came to really be fascinated with his personal story, the human story of how this Indian boy became Yogananda and wrote, the famous autobiography of a yogi, which has had an immeasurable impact. In fact, I'm teaching a course on it now, going through it. So I'm reading it again after reading it many times and finding new things in it. So I got fascinated by his story, but I could only devote so many pages to it. And after the book came out, I thought, what do I want to do next? Maybe a biography of one of the important gurus. And he came to mind, and I said, well, but he wrote the autobiography of a yogi. So I looked it over one more time, and I realized how much he left out. He left out so much that I thought, oh, there are gaps to be filled in his life, and somebody should do that, and somebody should do the proper research and all that. And that's why it came about.
Very interesting. And full disclosure, I'm a follower. I've been initiated in Kriya Yoga. So for me, it was a revelation to read your book and find out more details about Gurudev. So it's quite good to see a third party feedback and point of view of someone you really like and follow his teachings. But how come after so much research you didn't join the lineage?
Well, he had a big impact on me back when, at that period of seeking I told you about. But I'd already, when I read Autobiography of a Yogi, and I still have the copy that I read in 1970.
Wow.
Big hardcover. I always say I could not have afforded a hardcover in 1970, so I probably borrowed it and never returned it. And so I speak of Yogananda and write about him to make up for that karma of stealing a book. So he had a big influence on me. He's, there's a term in India called upaguru. And an upaguru is any teacher you learn something from, as opposed to, your guru, your main guru. He's a major upaguru for me. But I had already taken up TM. I already was on the way to becoming a teacher of it. And so I never became a formal student of Yogananda's. But I've learned a tremendous amount from him. And then when I decided to do this research, I thought it's better not to be a devotee or a disciple of his, because I want to maintain my objectivity and my credibility.
And how
So
it was going to India and interviewing all the people who were in contact with him. Anyone who was quite close, you still met, or second or third generation?
Yeah, by the time I was doing this research, there weren't very many people left alive who knew him. I did meet and interview 3, I think, certainly 2 Americans, both of whom discovered Yogananda in the late 1940s when they were young men, and were with him as disciples for a few years before he passed. And both of them went on to start their own small lineages teaching in his name. They were both alive when I was doing the research. They've since passed. So I did not get to meet enough people who knew him, 1 or 2 others, but he died in 1952. That's quite a long time ago.
So he saw the practicality of how East and West could learn from each other. He said that East will teach the spiritual practice of yoga adapted to the Christian cohorts, while the West will learn the technical and scientific discoveries. Do you think that the goal has been achieved in a balanced way, or one side got more than the other?
Well, that formulation goes back even to Yogananda's great predecessor, Swami Vivekananda, who had influenced him. And that notion that the West has aimed its intelligence at understanding the material world and using the discoveries to make life easier and better and all. Whereas the East directed the same, that spirit of inquiry to the inner life. And they both have much to teach one another. If you go to India now, you see the influence of the West, not in the background you have behind you. That's the eternal city of Varanasi.
Yes.
Where I've been several times, and I take tour groups to, and it doesn't change along the river. But if you go a few blocks in, where all the automobiles and motorcycles and shopping gets done, and if you go to New Delhi and Mumbai and all that, you see the influence of the West visibly everywhere. And it's not always pretty. India has adopted many traits and products of the West that have damaging effects, bad diets and stuff, things like that. But it's very visible. And it's something like the introduction of automobiles and computers and television, all those inventions obviously has a discernible impact on a culture. But the subtle influence of the East, which is what I wrote about in American Veda and to a certain extent in my biography of Yogananda, and that I talk about and teach all the time, that influence is much more profound and deep and I think enduring than people realize. It's one of the reasons I wrote those books. So it's not as one-sided as it would seem. If you look at how especially America, but I'm sure Canadians and Europeans as well, the attitudes about religion and spirituality and what constitutes happiness, what constitutes the good life, there's been vast changes in that over the last 50 or years especially. And that the direction of those changes is consistent and it accelerates with every generation. You see the influence of the East in there, and therefore of all the teachers who came here and established a foothold and who wrote books. And then they influence people, and those people influence other people. So the influences, I think, will turn out to be on an inner level as profound as the influence of the West has been on the material level.
Yes, thank you. I mean, several years ago, in fact, I did a test among my co-workers. Most of them were from India, working here in Canada. And I asked them, do you know of Paramahansa Yogananda? Do you know of Babaji? Do you know of Vivekananda? And to my surprise, they said no. But they're in late 20s, early 30s, and they're very focused on making it on the financial side, on the material side. They're not visiting any Indian temples while living here in Canada. So hopefully they will change perception a little bit later in life and go back to their roots, which is more spiritual than material.
I've seen that. When American Veda came out in India, when it was published in India, people in India sponsored a speaking tour for me to talk about the book. And I went to like 18 cities in India and spoke sometimes 3 times a day at places. And I noticed early on that my itinerary included a lot of schools. And it turned out that the sponsors of the tour had concerns about what you just described. All the young people turning to the West, becoming very secular, very materialistic, wanting, for understandable reasons to, have success and material comforts and all that. But we're looking at the spiritual traditions of their heritage in an unfriendly way, as that's old-fashioned. That's for grandma.
Yes.
And so they thought one way to convince young people that there is value there is to have someone from the West speak about it and talk about how people in the West have embraced traditional spiritual teachings of India, not necessarily in the old-fashioned way that's the customs in India, but through the gurus who are modern people and adapted the teachings to the scientific age. And I felt, boy, that's giving me way too much responsibility. But I found it was true. They were much more likely to pay attention to me than their daddy or, grandpa or something.
And
I came from America.
Exactly. And I think this is not pertaining only to India, but to Eastern European countries as well.
Probably.
I can tell you for sure, I was told by my friends that when someone from outside comes in to present or reinforce a local custom or a local celebrity, people will listen.
Yeah.
And they will either buy the book or they will follow the process of that particular teaching, but it has to be reinforced from outside in. That's very, very interesting.
It's fascinating. And in fact, some of the gurus who came here in my research, they knew that. And I remember being with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi in a big public event, and people said to him, "Why you spend so much time in the West? If what you're teaching is so good, why not? The Indian people would need it." He said they will listen when Western scientists validate these teachings, and that turned out to be very true. I remember being in India. I know it was 2001, and I opened the Sunday paper one day, big, English language paper in New Delhi. And on one of the sections on the front page was a big article with photographs about how yoga is good for you. And I thought, I'm in India. This yoga was born here thousands of years ago. This is the traditional teaching. But the article was all about Hollywood celebrities and scientists, Western scientists, proving that yoga is good for you. And so that, that spoke to them much more than, any article about a guru or, a figure that they would think of as religious.
Yes, and I think somehow, and correct me if I'm wrong, Yogananda didn't follow that path somehow, because he started teaching while he was in India. He had followers, and then when he came back, he became very, very popular. And the locals, the Indians, only had proofs of newspaper, some of newspaper clips, but other than that, they didn't have enough direct access to the media. It was them recognizing the saintliness and the teachings he was.
Yes, but it's also true, Claudiu, that when he returned to India for a year in 1935, he had been teaching in America for 15 years, and a lot of the newspaper coverage was about the triumphant return of our emissary to America, who's established this beautiful, these centers in America and all that. Same thing had happened to Vivekananda 30 years prior to that. He became a big celebrity in India because he was well received in America. So it meant a lot, and they were very proud that these ambassadors of the traditional teachings were welcomed and embraced by, America, which is, this forward-thinking, progressive place. It probably was surprising to them, but they loved it.
Yeah. Anyway, it was a lot of work, as you found out, and you mentioned in your book. It was a lot of hard work, which I don't know how many of us can sustain at that level of intensity.
Yeah, it was fascinating for me to dig deep into his life, and I should say one of the great things about Yogananda and the decisions he made. Most people who become monks, who become renunciates, they don't speak much about their personal lives prior to becoming a monk. They'll tell you, I grew up in South India and my father was, a doc, whatever. But they don't go into much detail. But he did. That's one of the reasons Autobiography of a Yogi is such a treasure, because you don't get intimate looks at people's early lives, people like that. And he continued to often talk about his life and his family and his childhood and what it was like in India and all that. And I found that fascinating. And one of the things I discovered one of my purposes in doing the biography was to fill in all the gaps about his life after he came to America, because he doesn't write about that very much detail in the autobiography. And in researching the, like missing years that we didn't know much about, one of the things I discovered was how hard he worked and how many challenges he had to overcome. It wasn't easy to accomplish what he did. He arrived in America in 1920. It was a very racist time of life in America. And he was a dark-skinned man with long hair and representing what most people at that time would have thought of as some primitive, superstitious religion and all that. And so he had a lot to overcome. And, he taught here during the Great Depression and the 20s, money was always a problem, paying the bills and all that. Just dealing with human beings in an organization. He worked, it was very challenging. And there were times when he wanted to just give it up and go back to India and live the simple life of a monk. But he knew his mission was to stay and do what he did. And I came to admire that a great deal and, realize, boy, you think of the life of a yogi, everybody loved them. They'd be, things would be easy, but they weren't necessarily.
Yes, and being in the inside right now, I am amazed with the fact that the organization survived 70 years beyond his transition. It's still going strong, is gaining more members all over the world. The material which is being published by Self-Realization Fellowship is just amazing. And it is my understanding that they still have a lot of teachings to publish over the next years.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've often asked what I attribute that to. Most of the gurus who made a big impact in the West and who founded organizations and buildings and books and all that, most of their legacy survives, but some are not doing as well, and some are doing well. And I think there are a few reasons for it. One, he, in the last years of his life, put a lot of attention into securing the legacy that he wanted to leave behind. Writing autobiography of a yogi was a big part of that. He knew that that would be his voice into the future, and it turned out to be true. I don't know what would have become of SRF and all that without the autobiography of a yogi. It's hard to know. But the other thing he did was train those close disciples of his to carry on his teachings after he was gone. And that first generation of direct disciples set the template for future leaders. And so far it's holding up. And the other thing he did was establish a financial foundation. Like most gurus, he was dependent on close followers of means, people who had money, one or two in particular, and they were very generous. And that legacy, that bequest, meant a great deal. So there's a lot of reasons for it. But you know what the main reason is? The ones that survive, they teach the ideas and practices that are taught work.
Yes, indeed.
If Yogananda's methods of meditation and other practices didn't work, if TM didn't work and change people's lives, we wouldn't even be talking about them now, because, we're pragmatic people. If something works, we do it. We tell our friends about it. Scientists do studies on it. People write books about it. If it works, it has, endurance.
Yes.
And that's really the bottom line. He could have written an autobiography. He could have had, but if the methods didn't work and if people's lives weren't changed for the better, it would disappear.
Yes, you're so right. So, Philip, another important book of Yogananda was, but less known in my opinion, is the Second Coming of Christ, and which is a very telling title. So, based on your experience, do you think the majority of Christianity still expects a physical return of Yeshua, or they somehow warm up to the idea that the second coming is from within us?
This is not my area of expertise, Claudiu. I do not make predictions. No, but let me put it this way. I'll speak personally. When I was a young seeker, I had very little interest in conventional religion. I was raised by Jews who were atheists. So, I didn't even go to synagogues, let alone churches. I went to church one Christmas when I was in high school because I had a crush on a Catholic girl. That was it. And, I had, no respect for any of that. But when I read Autobiography of a Yogi, I said, wow, wait a minute, this great guru, this great teacher had a lot of love and respect for Jesus. Maybe I'm missing something. So because of that, I went and read the New Testament for the first time. And I had read by then the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, and all. And as I'm reading the New Testament, the Gospels, I'm thinking, I get it. Jesus was a great guru. He was a great holy man with disciples. This reads like the Upanishads. And that changed my whole attitude toward things. Well, in all the years I've been researching and interviewing people, I met dozens and dozens of people who had the similar experiences. Most of them were Christians who were, raised Catholic or Protestant and became sometimes disillusioned as when they were young adults, left the church, but always felt some affection for Jesus, but didn't know what to make of it. And then they meet a guru, or they go to India and they meet a Swami, or they read Yogananda. And they say, oh, that makes sense. That interpretation makes sense. And if you look, earlier we were talking about the subtle influence of the East. If you look at the surveys of American religion, you find young people, every generation of young people, they're leaving churches and mainstream religion all the time. I'm guessing, from what I can tell, that more and more people have shifted in the, not necessarily literally the way Yogananda interprets Jesus and Christ, but in that direction of seeing Jesus as a great teacher or an avatar, an incarnation of God, like Krishna, like Buddha, depending on how you see these things, but who was teaching a way of being in the world and a way of understanding the world that's much more compatible with the teachings of the East than what's become of Western religion and Christianity. And I see that all the time. There's a lot of evidence for it. So, when he talked about the second coming of Christ, he meant Christ consciousness, not the person of Jesus. Christ consciousness being a kind of Western term that mystics and yogis might use in much the same way they would use the word Brahman or pure consciousness, or Atman, or Buddha nature. It would have that same feeling of a state of consciousness. And by second coming, he meant the awakening of that consciousness in the individual.
Yes, indeed.
Which is very consistent with yogic teachings. And I think, people are moving in that direction.
Yes, in fact, I was talking last week with Dr. Coney, which you also know, about the second coming of Christ, the book itself. And she agreed that if the Catholic priest and, the Orthodox priest will read this type of interpretation of the New Testament, they will have a aha moment. People will stay in the church if they will come with a rational explanation of what the teachings are, in fact, and won't be just a very cold reading from the Bible, but a very meaningful interpretation.
And if they would revive the contemplative, meditative practices that Christian mystics have, were using for hundreds or thousands of years, and that's happening. You see various forms of Christian and also Jewish meditation being taught. Some of it is just being adapted from teachers like Yogananda and the others into Christian and Jewish forms, and some of it are reviving mystical practices, what often called contemplative practices, that were developed by the Christian mystics and the Jewish mystics, but not made available to the average person, the everyday person. And now they are being.
Yeah. So. And to stay on this idea of education, I like to read a short paragraph from your book, the biography about Yogananda. It may seem ironic that a young man who had little use for school will be driven to start one of his own, but not when one considers why he disliked the school he attended. They bored him and they neglected the interior dimension of life. So do you think that today's educational system should be revamped completely in order to deliver a much more rounded human being and contain a spiritual component also?
I would love to see that. I see there's signs of it. I remember back in the day, in the 70s, and I should add there have been attempts at this. Yogananda started a school. That's what you were referring to. When he was, before he came to America. That school still exists. I've been there in Ranchi, but it's small. And there are other, there are schools, many of which have Vivekananda's name attached to them, attempting to bring the spiritual component, the inner dimension of life, into curricula, along with modern sciences and areas of scholarship. So there's a lot of that going on. And here in the West, people have tried it. I was involved with one. It still exists. There, we started Maharishi International University back in the early 70s. It still exists, but it's small. It's not a big thing, and there are other attempts like it. It's not easy to do, but you would hope that at the very least, people, at least in higher education, would take these teachings more seriously and understand them, more adequately, and make them available, if not as part of the curriculum, but as part of life in general. So, it's kind of disappointing that there's not more of it, but, maybe that kind of transformation takes more time.
Yes, at one point we should understand that this is an important component of our life, and we have to enrich it and give it more attention, and also on the practical side, not only on the theoretical one.
There's also resistance because a lot of attempts have been made to introduce yoga and meditation and everything into schools. But if it's a public school, then people worry that you're not supposed to introduce religion into it. And you could say, well, this is not religion. Yoga is a science and all that. And some school districts say, okay, we get it. It's not religious. But others have resisted. So it's an ongoing issue.
Yes. Let's talk more about North India tour experience, and what are you doing with these tours, and how often you organize them?
We started a company, American Veda Tours. I don't know, it must be 6-7 years ago now. The idea was to bring groups to India and focus on places and people connected to the gurus that we're most familiar with in the West. And we've done 4 of them, different locations. On 2 of those 4, we spent time in Calcutta and the environs around Calcutta, where Yogananda spent his formative years. And so we went to many sites associated with him. Other tours, there was less of him and more of other people. And we tried to go to the sacred places, the centers of spirituality and yoga, like Varanasi behind you. But because of COVID, we had to suspend our plans. And in fact, as we're recording this, we're trying to decide whether to go ahead with our plan for October of 2022, this current year, or postpone it, into next year, and we'll find out. But it's very fulfilling to do it. I love India, and I love people, and I love the places, and it's always very fulfilling to introduce people. And we get to, because of American Veda and my book on Yogananda, I have good contacts. So we get to meet some very good people, interesting people, and go to places that might not otherwise.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I was very excited when I browsed the itinerary on your website, and I got an itch to, maybe I will join. So
we'd love to have you.
Yes. What else are you doing? What other programs are you offering?
At the moment, I'm teaching a course. There's a school called the Hindu University of America, and I've done courses for them that essentially are based around the theme of American Veda, the whole history of all the teachers and teachings that came to the West and how they impacted the West. At the moment, because last month was the 75th anniversary of Autobiography of a Yogi, I'm teaching a course on the Autobiography of a Yogi. And we each week, 10 weeks, we take in sequence a segment of the book and discuss it. And that's been fascinating and great. And I'm sure we'll do it again. It's too late for your viewers to do it now, but we'll do it again through Hindu University of America. I have other things going on online. I'm working on some new books. And I may as well say it. I'm working on one of those books is a novel I've been wanting to write for about 30 years. And COVID forced me to give up one more excuse, which is I'm traveling too much. So now I'm working on it finally.
Yeah, so there are benefits of
yes,
what's going on these days.
Yeah.
Also, I reached autobiography through another person you mentioned in your book, Swami Kriyananda, which was again a Western and an American. And the funny thing is, he was born in Romania, when I am from.
Yes. Are you from Romania?
Yes. So I got my hand on a maybe early print of his biography with his signature, and that led me into the biography of a yogi. Later on, he moved out of the organization and he founded the Ananda village or Ananda communities. What's your perception about this type of community?
Remember earlier you asked me if I'd met any direct disciples of Yogananda, and I said I spent time with two of them, interviewing them. And he was one of them. So I met, when I first was researching American Veda, he was still alive. And I interviewed him, and I met him another one or two times. And the people who succeeded him, the couple who succeeded him after he passed, I consider very good friends of mine. In fact, I interviewed them on my podcast, Spirit Matters, about autobiography of a yogi just a few months ago. And I should add that the other person I met, the other direct disciple, was Roy Eugene Davis, who also split from SRF and started, in his case, a much smaller lineage. And he's on my podcast from a few years ago before he passed away. So I know the people who, and feel very close to the people at SRF, and also the people at Ananda, Ananda Sangha, Ananda Worldwide. And I know there was tension. I think it's kind of inevitable in almost every spiritual organization I know. There's always going to be, people who want to do things one way and people who want to do things another way. And then there's, breakaway organizations, and people go off and do their own thing, and some disappear and some succeed at it, like Kriyananda did, because Ananda's a successful project. And I have respect for, both organizations, and deep affection for many of the people in them. And to me, they're both doing their best to be faithful to Yogananda and his work and his legacy. And they may disagree on how to do it. They may have different policies, different programs. But I do not doubt the sincerity and good intentions of either of them. And I hope that any residual bad feelings disappear because, they're both worthwhile, and they might appeal to different people. So.
Yes, no, I have the same feeling about Swami Kriyananda, because he really embraced Guruji's teachings and love for humanity, and he even signed away his wealth to the community. He had nothing to his name when he passed. So when his inheritance came from his father, he used it to buy more land and enrich the community. So he didn't keep anything for himself. So in the end, I think that the teachings are important and people gain from this type of knowledge.
Yeah. And you can, if you look into it, there were lawsuits, very ugly things that happened between the two organizations. But if you look into it and you know the people, you see the sincerity and the love for Yogananda and his guru lineage and the respect. It's not like breakaways who then denounce where they came from and put themselves on a pedestal. Yogananda is still the person who's upheld as the guru and as the founder and all that. And that kind of respect is an important sign to me.
Yes, exactly. Philip, we are approaching the end of the interview. Any final thoughts?
No, it's been fun to be with you. I would invite people to go to my website, philipgoldberg.com, see what I'm doing, buy my books, listen to my podcast, spiritmatterstalk.com. And I will say, on that podcast, there's about 250 to 300 interviews in our archives. It's all free. And to me, it's a course in comparative spirituality just to go into our archives. So I'd invite people to join us and subscribe. It's free.
Yes. Anyone who is new to spirituality and wants to enrich his, universe should tap into this type of podcast because, as you mentioned, they are free and they can listen to them at any time. Once again, thank you very much for joining
today. Thank you, Claudiu. Pleasure.
And to my guests, thank you for watching. Share it, like it. Support me on patreon.com/Claudiu Murgan. Get a free copy of my book when you visit my website. And until next time, love and gratitude.